post-lunch dinner, post-lunch dip crowd, you know, at least you made it out. Just want to kick this off with a quick round of introductions. Let's start at the end, Clay.
Yeah, so I'm Clayton, the Director of Protocol Strategy at Figment, also a partner at Figment Capital. We're an institutional staking provider, so we're primarily servicing crypto-native VCs, exchanges, custodians, wallet providers on the back end, as well as more traditional financial institutions entering the space. On the Figment Capital side, we also invest in the infrastructure layer, so generally looking at scalability, privacy, interoperability, UX across the board.
Does it work? No. I'm Yannick from Course One. I lead partnerships and protocol onboarding as well. We are also a professional node operator operating on about 46 different networks now. And we also invest via our venture fund, Course Venture, similar to Figment and mostly infrastructure projects. We also have a research team that focuses on MEV and productizing kind of that research on the validator side. And yeah, happy to be here.
I'm Jack. I work at Nexus Mutual, lead the partnerships team there. Most of the work we've been doing the past year has really been on a slashing insurance alternative product. So most of my work is on modeling out the risk for operators. And then outside of that, I've done a couple grants with Lido around scoring different node operators and how you can use that system to potentially offer a permissionless staking module.
Cool. I just want to kick off this panel. You know, let's start with the best practices, the good stuff. So more particularly like Figment and Course One, like what are some of the practices that you take to reduce, you know, very defined and known events such as slashing, penalties, and downtime?
Yeah, so without getting super technical or trying to outline everything that we consider, we take a unique approach, I think, considered in comparison to the market, to where we really focus on safety over liveness. And for us, you know, looking at, you know, how you can get slashed as a node operator and how ultimately our customers' funds get slashed, you know, you have downtime penalties, you also have double signing penalties. If you're looking at it from, you know, an hour of downtime on a validator by validator perspective, looking at 32 ETH per validator, the cost of getting slashed for downtime is single-digit dollar amounts at the current price of ETH. Maybe a little bit higher now, given the current market uptick. When you're looking at a double sign event, that's 1.1 ETH currently, which is, you know, $2,200–$2,300. And so a lot of people, you know, see. There's a lot of vanity metrics, I think, in the operator space. You know, you're looking at uptime on, you know, explorers and helpful tools so people can make better decisions. But uptime performance, from our perspective, like, isn't actually a good indicator of the safetiness of working with a specific operator, if that makes sense. So we don't really employ as much redundant or failover infrastructure, I think, as other operators do in the space, specifically because of our, you know, risk aversion to a double signing event.
Yeah, I think we actually have a fairly similar approach. I think a lot of, or not a lot of, but some validators push for uptime because it's always a very prominent number, and most block explorers highlight that as well. So it's always top of mind, and a lot of clients that we work with that aren't super crypto native, you know, this is a number that they see and that they focus on. But for us as well, I think, you know, as Clay mentioned, like double signing is definitely probably the worst case scenario. So we also, you know, we have our own private test net that we open source, that we use to, you know, thoroughly test upgrades and automate that. We use a kind of local DB and a Web3 signer global DB to avoid kind of, you know, having, if a node goes down and there's failovers, to you know, have that node come up again at the same time. So I think for us as well, we take a similar approach when it comes to risk management. And I think when it comes to kind of the safety it is in the end, if you deal with larger clients, just a factor of how much can they lose. And yeah, as Clay mentioned, downtime is definitely a lot less critical. And so for us, we take a fairly similar approach there. We have monitoring 24/7. We have on-call engineers. So if something ever happens, we're kind of ready to jump on that. And yeah, I think it's one thing where you do sometimes see validators come in and focus on this number because it is very prominent and it works well in sales conversations where you say, well, we have 100% uptime, but it doesn't in the end mean all that much.
Yeah, from like a risk reward or risk assessment perspective, what's your take on essentially the safety over liveness approach?
We have a kind of unique, I guess, look into all the different operators' backends, given that they have to submit all the information for getting quotes. Generally, my take here is that a lot of operators try and over-optimize, over-automate a lot of the systems. I have a fairly strong opinion that you want to push for safety over liveness in almost all cases. I think some of the biggest, most high-profile slashing events that we've seen in the past 6 months have come through automated systems that have had failovers that have worked, and then the fail back has not worked so well. And that's because they had an automated process where the human was removed from the system, where they're just trying to optimize for uptime as much as possible. So in some of these examples, you're talking like servers go down, they're back up in like 5 minutes, and meanwhile you failed over to another server, and you're getting slashed for what would have been literally tens of dollars worth of downtime. Obviously, there's cases where there's a client bug or something, and there's sort of an indefinite potential loss to being offline. So I think generally my perspective is I have no real problem with companies having heavy human involvement on the process around taking servers on and offline. Prefer that actually than having everything automated.
Yeah, maybe just one note to that. I actually fully agree. I got to give a shout out to our infrastructure and platforms teams. The engineers are fantastic, and it does involve humans in the end, and you can't just automate everything away. So having a strong team there, I think is absolutely key. So I fully agree with that.
So moving on from best practices in the industry, I think it's also worth kind of taking pause and go deeper on what do you identify as some of the worst practices that you see around you? Not, obviously, you don't need to name names, but in a rapidly evolving industry and there's so much growth, what are the things that concern you?
Yeah, I mean, to the uptime point again, I think, I mean, you have a natural desire as a person where you're looking at a number, and if it can be 100%, you want to strive to get to that 100% number. And if you're running nodes for certain customers or you're running nodes for liquid staking protocol, et cetera, that's a vanity metric that's also beneficial to them. Or if that number is not what they expect it to be, they're going to have concerns, right? So that it's more of educating people appropriately and not trying to sell that as something that makes you better, because honestly, that's the one thing that could result in a catastrophic slashing event for your customer base or for your community. I think in terms of outside of looking at uptime as the peak indicator of performance, key management in general, right? Like making sure that there are not duplicates of a validator key existing anywhere within your stack or externally anywhere. Obviously, you don't want it to be external, but a lot of smaller slashing events have happened where folks have found keys and a storage container and it was like, oh shit, why are these here? And they turn them on and that validator was already running on the network, which has resulted in slashing events before. So I would say not focusing on uptime as a key indicator of performance and key management as the two main problems that I see.
Yeah, definitely key management, I think, is utterly important. I mean, we've seen it a lot. You touched on it as well, where your node goes down and you have a failover, and that works great, but then both nodes come up at the same time again if you don't have like proper controls there to manage the keys in the nodes. Yeah, you look at double signing and slashing. I think one other thing is just geographic diversity. I think, I mean, it is a cost factor, right? And if you start up, you maybe want to start more, one data center localized. But we've seen that before, that a whole country goes dark, or at least there's blackouts, and so I think having some redundancy in terms of geographic diversity. We've seen things happen over the last few years where no one really thought they would on a global scale. So I think, yeah, being able to spread out your nodes and have redundancies across multiple countries and ideally continents, if you can manage that, I think is also one thing that I think is super important. And I think especially when you're kind of a young company and start up, it's obviously a hard thing to do. You don't have the resources, the manpower, but I think it is an issue as well when you just focus on one location at the start and then take too long to kind of diversify.
Yeah, I mean, and you also want to be aware of correlated slashing, especially on Ethereum and Polkadot. So, and being aware of other validators that you're not operating that are validating on Ethereum or Polkadot, for example. I mean, there's no slashing on Solana, but when that server farm went down, I think in like Finland, right? If that happened on Ethereum, to where you park the majority of your validators in the same place that everyone else parks their validators in, and that warehouse goes down, you could suffer not just a 1 ETH slashing event; it could be much more per validator.
In terms of testing, in terms of I think worst practices, probably what we see is. You can kind of look at Rated or something, some sort of data stack, and you see in the analytics that most operators are fairly similar in terms of performance. But then there's this kind of like underlying risk that I think most people don't get to see, and there's massive differences between operators that seemingly have the same performance, however you want to track that. I think in terms of worst practices, most of what we're seeing is operators cutting corners, probably because they want to try and boost their margins a little bit. Like the margins for node operators are fairly thin, and so if you can cut a couple corners, boost your margins a little bit, then that obviously helps. So we're seeing that by potentially running clusters of validators that are way larger than we would like to see. Or maybe kind of just putting everything in one server, having it on one AWS setup rather than trying to diversify in some factors. Just because at the end of the day, it costs a lot more to run multiple different setups across multiple different servers with multiple different clients. So I get why they're doing it, but obviously would prefer to see people try and be a bit more conscious of the risk.
So all the, let's call it risks or events that we discussed, like slashing, penalties, downtime, essentially like, pretty direct losses, they're all well-known, documented, and researched. I think it's kind of important to underline that risk management is as much about preparing for what you actually don't know. So from your kind of perspectives, and I want to start with Jack, like what are the unknowns that you kind of are scared about?
So you're asking about what risks are there outside of slashing?
If you have to speculate, yeah.
I think probably one of the risks that I think a lot of people maybe don't think a lot about would be sort of like existential level risk. Obviously, it's easy to say, well, it's like the chance of it happening is 0.001, but it only has to happen once. Obviously, the chain relies on people actually believing that it'll work, and so I get a little bit concerned when I see things like empty blocks, missed blocks. At the end of the day, the job of an operator is to ensure that transactions can actually happen. And if you're not facilitating transactions, to me, that is quite concerning. So at the end of the day, like if people can't trust the network to operate correctly and efficiently, then there's just financial risk in terms of even holding ETH as an operator or as a staker.
So known unknowns or unknowns. I think for me, like one of the unknowns is always a little bit that validators and generally operators support kind of different new primitives as well, where you may not be aware of it yet. And I do think a lot of it, like this is probably not for me so much on Ethereum, but especially like on other newer chains launching, where there's a lot of like coordination required and a lot of kind of figuring out what the best way is to set up. And then you have inexperienced operators come in and kind of maybe don't have the experience to do what's right for the chain. So I think this is sometimes, I mean, it's not as much for Ethereum, I would say, but I think we see that quite often that, when a new chain launches, that there's, some instability and things that aren't going, according to plan. And then it's really important to kind of have everyone kind of pull in the same direction and work on a solution. And sometimes if that doesn't happen, that just creates additional risk. I would say that's one that I've seen quite often.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point about cutting corners, maybe an unknown from a token holder perspective also is the fact that, as more validators enter, the Ethereum ecosystem, as long as execution layer rewards are the same, like your reward rate is effectively going to go down as a validator. That may be seen as an unknown risk to where, margins are thin. People may be cutting corners because, the revenue as a node operator is going down. I would say, also as a token holder, you want to be thinking about how these validators are funded, especially if people are using smart contracts on chain. If they're pooling rewards from a regulatory perspective, that would be deemed a risk for token holders as well. Trying to think of, I lost my thought.
Hello. I think one other thing is obviously like it's kind of easy to look at Lido, for example, and be like, Lido is X% of the network or whatever. I think probably where I'm more concerned is where people don't know where the centralization is. So there's unknown level of centralization and a lot of different risk factors that people are, I think, almost completely unaware of. There's a lot of node operators, for example, that have many, like 10x times the number of validators that people are aware they have. There's high levels of centralization in terms of hosting companies, legal jurisdictions of validators, of node operators, physical geographies of where the servers are located. And so, there's nice components to having everything permissionless and you don't know who the operators are, that's great. But then you also have this like slowly building centralization risk that is kind of hard to track. And that makes it pretty hard to combat too. Like it's fairly easy to combat Lido relatively because everyone's aware of it, everyone talks about it. It's fairly transparent in terms of how many validators they have. So I would encourage people to maybe spend a little bit more time thinking about ways to try and track some of these data points that are concerning and maybe a little bit more challenging to keep an eye on.
Also requesting pre-signed exit transactions as a staker from your node operator.
Cool. So we've talked about best practices, worst practices, risk management, etc. So over the past, I would say, a year and a half, 2 years, both traditional insurance companies and DeFi projects such, as Nexus, as ourselves, we've developed like all these products and policies to cover against slashing, penalties, etc. Like from a staking provider perspective, how do you approach like this combination of traditional insurance and like more DeFi native on-chain offerings?
Yeah, so we offer a mix, and then we allow people to purchase additional insurance if they want to. So we're insured as a company. We give people an opportunity to purchase additional insurance, both off-chain and on-chain, through a few providers, and Nexus is one of them. And yeah, I mean, we're constantly exploring ways to de-risk staking in general, right? I mean, degens have a much different risk appetite than institutions that are slowly creeping in, and the people that aren't here yet have even a smaller risk appetite than those people, right? So if we can get staking Ethereum to 99.99% risk-free, it just opens up addressable market and types of network participants that will be validating the Ethereum blockchain. I think the two things that we look at as a node operator is how can we de-risk, and then how can we increase the reward rate as much as possible without adding additional risk. We have insurance, but also looking at on-chain solutions like DBT, as well as is something that we're exploring for 2024.
Yeah, for us, I would say it's similar. It kind of starts with our SLAs, right? This is kind of covered by our own balance sheet and our own insurance, and then we have a mix of on-chain and off-chain on top. I think it's still fairly early when it comes to staking insurance in general, and there's not really any standards yet. I think you see that especially with more traditional insurance providers, that they are kind of working through how does staking work, what are the different risk factors, how do they differ from an Ethereum to Solana to other chains as well, and figuring out how they can kind of best provide coverage. So what we've seen a lot was it starts with Ethereum, but then if you want additional chains, then it starts to get more difficult. And I think as more kind of institutional players come into the space, but also as more players that are already in the space get more sophisticated, I think having a mix of on-chain options that are kind of on-chain and visible, and then more off-chain insurance and agreements as well, I think will definitely continue to grow as kind of a market and providers grow as well. I think one other thing for us is that when we look at insurance right now, it's fairly expensive still. So adding it as an option for our customers, often the customers are like, hey, we want insurance. We're not happy with just the SLI insurances that you guys provide, and then we offer options that are but this eats into our already kind of it's a thin margin business. This eats into our rewards. What are our other options? And so I think as standards kind of get established a little bit more, and it's a bit more clear what are the actual risks over time, as Ethereum matures as well, I hope that some of the pricing kind of comes down a little bit, so it's a bit more competitive, because I do think it makes sense if you are a large capital allocator to have insurance.
So what do you think is the catalyst that is needed for this actually to be taken more seriously, to put it that way? Because Jack can opine as well, but we get a lot of inbound, but it tends to either die at the point of the operator, or people just passing the buck because they don't know who's going to pay for it.
Yeah, I think a lot of clients just try to put that on us as operators. No, you should provide the full insurance and you should pay for it. That's what we see a lot. I think catalyst could be twofold. Either something bad happens, right, and it's all of a sudden top of mind that everyone is aware that, hey, slashing exists and I can lose my money, even though it's mostly risk-free currently, and nothing bad really has happened recently. We've never been slashed before. It can happen, and so I think that could be one catalyst. And the other is just, kind of as more traditional players come into the space, the risk profile changes a little bit from, hey, we're a bit more, kind of as crypto-native VCs, crypto-native hedge funds, maybe have a bit more of a risk appetite than a pension fund, and for them kind of to look at it as no, we need all the assurances and insurance that we can get, I think can also change the conversation a little bit.
And Jack, from a product development, where is this going?
I think most of the product itself is actually developed, in terms of the insurance or the insurance alternative that's being offered. But I think there's a lot of product development left to do there. I think most of it comes down to the economics of who is going to pay for it, where's the money going to come from. In terms of pricing, your insurance or insurance alternative might end up being 2-3% of the yield that you're getting, so 0.1% or whatever. Certain operators or pools or custodians are taking 25% of the yield. So there's kind of fairly high rent extraction happening already. There's not that much yield left for the customers to pay for any insurance with. I think ultimately, anyone that's not staking today but is holding ETH, that's kind of by definition they're saying the risk reward of staking is not worth it for me. And so you either have to somehow increase the reward, which is fairly hard given the spec is locked, or you have to decrease the risk. And so that's really the only lever left to try and get people who are holding ETH but not staking currently into the ecosystem. And so one way you can reduce the risk would obviously be insurance, DVT. You know, I think it's kind of like you want to package them all together, ideally, to try and get any of that sideline capital to actually be staked.
Cool. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? Like, what is, you know, it's funny because we were just talking, like last year we were both at the staking summit when FTX went under, and now obviously it seems that we might be on the cusp of something new. Like, what are you excited about?
Really excited for FTX 2.0, for sure. But I mean, I think you know, from a staking perspective, restaking is definitely the next thing that we're looking at as a node operator, in terms of being able to offer a higher reward rate. Obviously, that comes with a lot more risk as well, and every AVS is going to have different slashing parameters, different reward rates. I'm sure that's going to be an excellent exercise for Nexus Mutual to figure out how to price. But for the customers that are interested in that boosted reward, it's definitely something that we want to offer as an operator. And I think in terms of new, I mean, like, you have, just because we're servicing, what we call institutional clients, I think the idea of L2s on Bitcoin and potentially running nodes on them to be giving native Bitcoin rewards is attractive for folks that are mostly either holding Bitcoin or Ethereum. So that's something that we're definitely looking at in 2024 as well.
Yeah, I think for us in general, it's restaking, DVT, all these new technologies coming up, and trying to stay on top of that and figuring out how do we best leverage them, right? Is one thing where we spend a lot of time on. I also mentioned the research side as kind of more validators come online and the yield kind of goes down on Ethereum. If the risk management side is out of the way, everything else is about yield. And so for us, kind of like understanding these new primitives and figuring out how do we best position ourselves, how can maybe restaking work, and then also how does maybe DVT help to reduce the risk of validators is one thing where we spend a lot of time in understanding it. And yeah, I think otherwise, as as Clay mentioned, a lot of institutional players coming into the space slowly, but they're very slowly coming. Risk profiles change, and also the what they expect from us as node operators may change. And so just kind of being on the cutting edge there and understanding new trends and new developments is I think utterly important for us.
I think probably the thing that I'm most excited about would just be anything that actually is usage. So anything which actually leads to people actually making transactions and using the chain for something. That is probably what I'm most excited about. Like, I love the technology, don't get me wrong. Like, it's cool to build out all this stuff, and that's awesome. But it's actually only useful if it's actually being used to facilitate something. So anything that anyone's doing around real world or so there's some interesting Oracle stuff which can potentially help facilitate more usage of the chain. That is where almost all of my hope and focus is, I think, for the rest of this year. So if anyone's doing anything that actually facilitates using the chain more, like exponentially more, then I would love to chat to you.
The next billion users are coming, right?
Let's end the talk here with that hope. Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.